dive in. So I wanted to start with some recommended reading. The book that I started with was The Square Foot Gardening Method by Mel Bartholomew. He is the founder of the Square Foot Gardening Method, and there are many different variations and editions of this book available. The Niagara Library System does have several copies available, so I checked this book out. Mel makes the process of raised bed gardening seem very easy. So I was like, I'm going to dive in and try this. So I would highly recommend researching his book and checking it out. The next book that I would recommend is The Raised Bed Revolution by Tara Nolan. She is a Canadian gardener who was really inspired by the raised bed movement. This is a pretty current book. It might be 2017. And so she compiled this really beautiful book of all different types of raised bed gardens, I think across the United States and Canada. So it gives you a lot of inspiration of what you can do with raised beds. And then she has some really beautiful detailed plans of how to make different unique beds, like the beds with the little seat benches. She's got a plan to build like a really nice stackable potato box that you can like keep building up as your potatoes are growing. So this one, the Batavia Library does have it. So if you want to check it out first, they have it there as well. So my resources for this presentation, these were my favorite resources. Basically, if you Google raised beds with the word extension after it, it will bring up a plethora of fact sheets from university cooperative extensions from across the nation. These were typically my most favorite that I used to put this presentation together. University of Florida has a really nice fact sheet on how to build, like actually construct the 4x4 raised bed. So yeah, if you Google raised bed and extension together, it brings up that research-based knowledge and not just like gardening.com. Okay, so what are raised beds? They're not anything new. We've been growing in raised beds for hundreds of years, and there are two different types. There's mounded or freestanding beds, and then there are structured beds. So the mounded beds, you have to build them up. So you build up 6 to 12 inches of soil, and then you would want to top dress with 2 to 3 inches of compost or organic material. And they would be 3 to 4 feet wide. You don't want to go too wide because you want to be able to reach into the bed from either side. And it could be as long as you want it to be long. The only downfall with the mounded or the freestanding beds is that they compress, they settle over the growing season. And because the sides are loose, they settle, they kind of spread out. So you have to rebuild them every year and reshape them every year, where the structured bed it's held permanently in place by a structure. So wood, metal, rocks. And so the soil is contained within that structure and it doesn't settle as much. Typically, you just have to top dress your structured raised beds like 1 to 2 inches of compost a year.
So, excuse me.
Yeah.
I just got a raised bed that's good. My other ones were 7 inches high. The one I got, that takes a lot more dirt. So could I just put topsoil in the bottom and then top dress it?
You could, I just would be really careful about where you get your topsoil from. Just make sure it's really good quality topsoil.
Yeah.
And the only thing is you want to make sure you have really good drainage, and the topsoil tends to get more compacted. Yeah, so with raised bed gardening, we'll go into the soil mix that you actually put inside. So there are several advantages to raised bed gardening. A lot of it has to do with fitting your space. So sometimes if you're on a small city lot, the area that gets full sun might be like at the beginning of your driveway by your garage on the actual asphalt. So you can build a raised bed right on top of that. They don't have to be necessarily on the ground in the yard. And the soil warms up really quickly in the spring. So you can actually get working in the raised bed a lot sooner than you can in the ground. They drain really well. So they work really well for areas that have poor drainage, compacted soil, maybe an area where the soil has been potentially contaminated. You don't have to till them. Because you're creating a mix or purchasing a pre-made mix, the soil stays really like loose and light and fluffy. So it's a lot easier to weed and maintain. And of course, you don't have to till it. And you can get a lot of yield out of a small space. You can pack a lot of plants in a raised bed garden and produce a lot of vegetables. And they can also be built at different heights. So accessibility is a big factor for raised bed gardening. You can build them higher up so you don't have to get so far down on the ground to weed and manage that bed. Some of the disadvantages are the upfront labor costs. So it does take an investment to build these beds. The soil does tend to dry out quickly in the middle of the summer. So they do require a little bit more watering, maybe a drip irrigation system, and they tend to be pretty permanent. So, once you place them, they can be a hassle to move. Whereas when you're rototilling, you can kind of pick and move around your yard a little bit easier. So they are permanent. And of course, there is more labor to build them if you have like a larger slope in your yard. So you decided you're going to go for it. You're going to build a raised bed garden. You still have to pick your location as if you were gardening in the ground. So if you want to grow vegetables, you want to pick a location that receives 6 to 8 hours of direct full sunlight. That is key for growing tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, any of your squashes. They need at least 6 to 8 hours of full sun. And then you also want to consider where's your water source, because in the beginning, it's really easy. You just have to water a little bit. But then in the heat of the summer, when it gets really hot and you need to water almost every day or every other day, dragging the water cans all the way across your yard gets really old. So you want to think about where your water source is. How far can you run a hose if you want to hook up drip irrigation? And then you want to keep the beds within 3.5 to 4 feet wide. You don't really want to go wider than 4 feet because you want to be able to reach into the middle from either side of the bed without stepping into the bed. You don't want to compact that soil. And if you're building more than one raised bed, think about your layout, your overall garden layout. How much space do you need in between the beds? Do you have a wheelbarrow? How much space do you need to kneel down to weed and to plant? Do you have a garden cart that you're going to pull through? I set up mine where I think they're pretty narrow, like in between some of the rows, but then I have a wider main path down the center. Also think about consistent bed size. So I started with 3 4x4 beds, and then I went kind of crazy and just started making all these weird random sizes. And now in the long run, that is not efficient. I wish I would have made them all the same size so that I could transfer over maybe netting or support structures easier. So think about those things for the long term. And then if you do have a lot of perennial weed pressure, if you're planting right in the yard, you can just put down cardboard, like a thick layer of cardboard, and then fill your bed, and that cardboard will, disintegrate and rot away. But if you do have a lot of perennial weed pressure, you might want to consider putting down a more permanent landscape fabric. I have a lot of bindweed in my yard, and I have constant bindweed that comes up. I don't necessarily think the landscape fabric would have stopped it. I think it would have made its way through. But if you have a deep enough bed, you can put that landscape fabric underneath.
Underneath ground, or is the wood underneath?
It's just the ground underneath. And so when building on a slope, this picture shows you how you would want to level and build into that slope so that the beds are even. My garden kind of runs downhill, and I wish I would have spent the time to kind of dig out the ends that were higher up on the hill, because when I water, the water just like runs down the bed to one end. So it is worth the time to level out the beds if you're on a slope. Okay, so different materials, and there are tons of different materials to choose from. And I just want to put it out there from the very beginning that the materials you choose are your personal choice. They're what you feel safe using and growing edible fruits and vegetables in, and it's what fits your budget. So there are wood, stone, metal, tons of different materials to choose from. So I'm going to go through them kind of one by one. So the first one is obviously wood. That's the most common material for raised bed garden structures. And you would want to choose a rot resistant variety. So you have your cedar, hemlock, Osage orange, black locust, black walnut. But of course, the rot resistant woods are either sometimes hard to find or they are the most expensive option. So it depends on what fits your budget. They'll last you many years, but they do cost considerably more than pressure treated lumber. There has been a big debate in the past about pressure treated lumber. So as of 2004, they no longer treat pressure treated wood with the chemical that used arsenic as the main ingredient. It was known as CCA. They now treat the pressure treated wood with a copper-based solution. It's known as ACQ. So you can look at the tag on the end of the lumber or maybe check with the lumber store and see if you can find out if it's pressure treated with that ACQ chemical. And they have done limited research to kind of see, okay, how much of that chemical leaches out in the soil. Copper is a naturally occurring chemical nutrient in the soil to begin with. And they found that very little is taken up by the actual plants in the bed. So I personally used pressure treated wood for my raised beds, but again, that's a personal choice that you can make. But do not use railroad ties. They are treated with creosote. It's really nasty stuff. The plants just touching the railroad ties will die. So I can't even imagine what that puts into the soil. So you can use logs from fallen trees. You can put them together to build a frame. They'll last for several years before they decompose. You can use stacking timbers. With the stacking timbers, you either want to notch the ends so that they lock together, or you'd want to drill each end and then pound in like rebar or some sort of fastener. You want to make sure the corners are secure so it doesn't fall apart when you're leaning on it or working near it. You can get creative. I really love this kind of snail-shaped build. It was from a company out of Canada. And then Savvy Gardening is a really awesome site for inspiration. I believe Nikki Jabor, she's a Canadian gardener. I believe she is one of the founders of the Savvy Gardening site, and they have just great pictures of raised bed gardens to get inspiration and ideas. And I really loved this hexagon shape and how they have it at different levels so you can garden at different heights. You can stack up the wood so that you can make it higher and more accessible to garden in. You just really want to make sure your corners are supported. They make some really nice pre-made raised bed garden corner brackets. You can also buy strapping from the hardware store. If the bed is longer than 6 feet, you want to add a center support at that 3-foot mark, or if it's 8 foot at the 4-foot mark. So you could pound in a pine stake or a rebar stake just to prevent those sides from blowing out. When you do stack taller like this, there are a couple different ways to kind of fill the bed so that you don't have to add so much soil material inside. Some people use old 5-gallon buckets. Some people put totes like upside down inside because it helps take up the volume. Some people build a false bottom, so they would put like cinder blocks and then a sheet of plywood and then fill, but the soil would be deep enough so that the roots wouldn't be hitting those materials. And then in the next slide, I have the Hugelkultur raised bed. So Hugelkultur is a method that's like centuries old. What they would do is they would pile logs and branches and plant debris in a big mound, and then they would fill it, like cover it in soil. So you can basically replicate it in a raised bed, but do your research because you cannot use all types of trees. Like you can't use black walnut. I'm not sure if spruce is an option. Like some trees give off a toxin when they're decomposing. So you want to make sure you pick the right species to put in there. But it's a good way to fill the space. And what happens is when those logs and those branches are decomposing, They provide nutrients to the soil, and they also act as a sponge. So they'll absorb the moisture, and then during a dry spell, they'll release that moisture into the soil. So if you're going to do a deeper bed, you might want to consider making it a Hugelkultur raised bed. You can use stone. There's pavers, bricks, field stone, cinder blocks. You just want to make sure that the structure is stable and sound. You don't want to have it falling apart on you. And then just be careful of cinder blocks. They may contain fly ash, which is a byproduct of the coal industry. So just see if you can find out the ingredients if you're worried about that kind of getting into the soil. Also, concrete materials will leach lime into the soil. So it raises your pH and makes your soil really alkaline. So you might want to check that periodically and see if you need to bring that pH down. Vegetables really like to grow between like 6.8 and 7.2 pH levels. So keep an eye on that if you're going to be using concrete. Metal is a really another popular option. So they have some really awesome metal kits now. They do have the wood kits as well. Like there's a lot of pre-made kits that you can buy and assemble yourself out of wood. Then they also have the metal. Gardener's Supply Company has these really nice round, like corrugated metal, different shapes and sizes of raised beds that you can put together. They're usually made out of powder coated metal or stainless steel, aluminum, galvanized. You can also use livestock stock tanks or water troughs. The only downfall with metal is that it does heat up really fast. So in the summer, it could be too hot. It's going to be too hot for your cool loving crops like kale and lettuce and spinach, you know, but your heat loving crops like tomatoes, peppers, they would do fine in a stock tank. And again, you might have to Hugelkultur or kind of false bottom that tank if you don't have the material to fill the entire thing. So these pictures came in from Howard Sinclair. I believe he's out in Leroy. He heard about the raised bed gardening program when I gave it back in 2021. And so he sent us in these awesome pictures of his raised bed garden. So he's got all these livestock tanks. He's got his drip irrigation running. And you could also check like local auction sites for used livestock tanks, a little bit cheaper than buying new, but just he got creative and I really like his idea. These wash bins, I bought these galvanized wash bins last year at an auction and they're like at the perfect height. I have that blue planter next to it. They're the perfect height for planting leaf lettuces. So it's on my back porch. I plant some radishes, leaf lettuces, and then you can just go right out there, trim some lettuce for like a sandwich or a hamburger, and it's just really handy. Other materials are grow bags. These are really popular. They're cheaper. They're reusable and they air prune the roots. So the roots get air pruned off and the plant does not become root bound. The only problem is that they do dry out really fast. So you have to stay on top of watering and fertilizing with them, but they are a good option if you only have a limited raised bed space. You can crop rotate using grow bags. So I've seen them come with the trellis for tomatoes. So maybe you grow your tomatoes in these one year and then you move your tomatoes to the raised bed the next year. They're also like, if they're small enough, they're portable, so you can move them around your deck or patio. You can also use 5-gallon buckets. This is my garden. When I first started, we had an apartment and it had a fieldstone patio. So I bought all these Home Depot 5-gallon buckets and I drilled holes in the bottom, but because they were so tight on the stones, I didn't have them elevated. They weren't draining properly. So I drilled some holes along the side, just like an inch from the bottom to allow them to drain. And I still use them today to grow bell peppers, jalapeno peppers. They work really great for that. Yep, so there's one plant in each bucket with a tomato cage.
Oh, yeah.
And just get creative. Look around, see what you have. What can you turn into a raised bed? The one on the left, it looks like one of those carts from the laundromat that they turn into a raised bed. The one on the right looks like it's a galvanized tub on some sawhorses. The biggest part of this is just to add drainage. Make sure you add some drainage holes to the bottom so that your plants don't get waterlogged. these are, more ways to be creative. I love the beds on the left. They're from the University of Arizona. They're made out of that corrugated sheet metal, and then they have a really beautiful wood frame. On the right, you'll see this sometimes in like Gardener Supply. They have their own raised bed kit, and then they have a fancy arch. But this arch, I think, is literally just a sheet of cattle panel or hog panel from like your livestock supply, and you just arch it over and put some rebar in. And so you can just get really creative. If you Google on Google Images raised bed ideas, you'll come up with tons of inspiration. So for the purpose of this talk, I thought I would just run through really quickly on how to make the very basic 4x4 standard raised bed. So you would want your bed to be at a minimum 6 inches deep. So a 6-inch wide board. You can go up to 12. 10 is usually the most basic one. You just want to, when considering the depth of your bed, consider where it's going to be. If it's going to be on a solid surface with no ground underneath, I would make it as deep as possible. You would at least 12 to 14 inches so that the roots have enough space to reach out and they have enough soil. If you do the 6-inch, it might not be enough. But if you do the 6-inch on the ground, the roots will leave, they'll go into the ground underneath the raised bed. So you'll be fine.
Will they do that if you have cardboard and landscape fabric?
They won't do it if you have landscape fabric. So if it is a shallower bed, I would do the cardboard because that will disintegrate and then they'll be able to access the ground. But the cardboard is a great smotherer. If you put it right on the grass, put the cardboard down and you can fill it with the soil medium and you can plant right into it because that cardboard will smother the grass.
Yeah.
You want to alter the corner joints when building a raised bed. When we first built our raised beds, we just ran like 2 boards down, capped it at the end, capped it at the other end, but that does not make a square 4-foot by 4-foot bed. So I'll show you in the next slide when we get to it, like that they alternated the corners when they assembled the bed. It can be also helpful to look for the heartwood, the curved rings on the end of the board. If you can try when constructing your bed to make sure that those curves are facing in, they're going towards the inside of the bed. It just helps when the wood ages and it might warp a little as it ages and dries. It'll curl in towards the bed, so it curls in on itself. Whereas if you have it facing out, it's going to curl out away from the bed. It's not detrimental to making the raised bed. I just have noticed it on mine that some of them are pulling away opposite of the bed and you can see the screws. It's just unsightly. And if, again, use the center support if it's longer than 6 feet. And you can use, they make pre-made corner brackets, which are super easy now. So you just slide the boards in, screw them into place. Again, the strapping brackets, or you can just use screws. So you need a drill with assorted bits, 20 coarse threaded 2.5-inch galvanized or treated deck screws. And you need 2-inch by 10-inch boards that are 8 feet long or 4 feet. But if you go to the lumber yard, typically they will cut an 8-foot board in half for you. So you'll have 4 4-foot pieces of lumber. And then you need some cardboard or weed cloth, whatever you're going to use on the bottom. And this is from the University of Florida Extension fact sheet. So all of this is online and they have it. It's a really great fact sheet. So what you would do is you would stack up your boards and you would pre-drill the 4 to 5 holes on the end of each of the board, one end on each of the board. And then what you would do is you would line up your board. And so the board that's pre-drilled, you would butt it up to the end of the board that is not pre-drilled, screw it together, line the end of that pre-drilled board up to the end that's not pre-drilled, drill it together until your bed is completed. And I have a better photo in the next slide. So you can see like right here, this end was screwed and they screwed into the non-screwed. This end had the pre-drilled screw holes, they screwed into the non-screwed. And so the corners are alternated. They didn't just put the sides down and butt up the ends. So they alternated the corners, which makes the inside of the box square. It makes it an even like shape. It won't be off, which makes it a lot easier for square foot gardening.
Hugelkultur is great if you source from your friends that have woods and things like that, leaf debris,
Yes.
tree debris. That's the beginning of your hugelkultur. You may not want to do raised beds if you have plenty of space both directions. You can actually mound, which makes it very easy for you to mow around your beds. Also, when putting in raised beds, if you backfill the outsides, they tend to hold up longer, and you can plant things like your marigolds and herbs that repel insects or bring insects in to eat your marigolds and then they die around the perimeter of your garden.
Yeah.
Square foot gardening. I used to love to watch that guy on PBS. You can still find some of this stuff on YouTube.
Okay.
There's also a company here in the United States of America who is making a fabric base above ground, you know, the round and square beds, but they're made out of a military grade linear nylon that does not breathe on the sides, only breathes at the bottom,
Okay.
which prevents the drying out.
Yeah.
They're actually assembled in Mexico, but it is an American company here. Can't remember the name of them off the top of my head, but I have used, you know, fabric products from eBay or Amazon. They do dry out faster. You can wrap them with saran wrap.
Yeah.
But the air pruning is fantastic. It's root pine.
Yeah, they suffer. Yeah.
Really don't produce nearly as well as they would. And in out there in the root system, it tells the plant, hey, we're out of room. We have to work with what we got here for soil. And there's hormones that move up and down through the plant, just like a human body or another animal. And so when that plant is signaled that it's out of room for the roots, it's going to make the top of that plant the best it can possibly be. Then peppers and stuff like that. Hey, open the air pods, the plants in your environment. And there's also great charts online. If you look up how big a container do I need for how big a container do I need for watermelon. If you're going to grow watermelons, you're going to need 100 gallons. It's going to be huge. Maybe better off in a mound.
Yeah.
So, and by mounding, you do save yourself a lot of materials and stuff. Much easier to trim around than a raised bed. So in some circumstances, you can save yourself a lot of materials, like, you know, putting in a bunch of wood debris, leaf debris, which has lots of live fungi in it, which is great for the root system. You know, leaf mulch and stuff like that, or black mold that's in it. Not great for us, wonderful for the roots. So if you start by knocking all that stuff, and then bring in topsoil, or maybe you're putting in common berms and mounds. Well, people have been farming the Three Sisters, corn, bean, and squash on the mounds in this area for 13,000 years. Doesn't work. So great presentation. I wish I could stay for the rest.
Thank you. I'm a Genesee County Master Gardener, so through the Cooperative Extension. Brandy.
Randy, I've got one. So
Nice to meet you.
I probably won't be able to because I'm going to get this.
Happy planting.
Oh, always remember, no garden, well, it doesn't matter if you're a master gardener and show the test for this, no garden will ever turn out the way you intended it to.
Yeah.
So diversify. Plant more than one thing. Don't just plant tomatoes and find out your tomatoes fail. And then you just really don't want to garden again. It's a disaster. Plant some squash, plant some radishes, plant some. I can't get my carrots. Better than what I do. You know, I'm terrible with carrots. Because I got other stuff. So,
Yep.
there you go.
Perfect. Thank you, Brandy.
You have a great day.
You too. So you built your raised bed and you want to fill it and you don't know how much you need. So there is a formula for it. The Square Foot Gardening website also has a calculator online that's available. They have some really great planting charts too. They have a newsletter. So I would check that out if you're interested in the Square Foot Gardening method. But basically you want to multiply the length by the width, by the depth, and it will give you the cubic feet. And so the calculations do need to be done in feet. So for our example, we built a 4 foot by 4 foot, 10-inch high raised bed. So to get that 0.83, I divided 10 by 12 inches in a foot, and it gave me the 0.3. So this calculation is 13.28. So we need probably 14 cubic feet of soil material to fill that raised bed, because it will settle over time. So you can purchase pre-made raised bed mix. It can be a little pricey. You want to make sure it's a combination of peat moss, compost, and vermiculite or perlite. Mel Bartholomew's whole method is that it is a soilless mix. So it's not involving topsoil or anything brought in like that. You can certainly make your own mix using topsoil. There's a blend of 40% topsoil, 40% compost, and 10% coarse drainage material. So you could use sand, no fine than builder's grade, or the vermiculite or the perlite. Mel's mix is 1/3 blended compost, 1/3 peat moss or coconut coir, which coconut coir is the sustainable choice. Peat moss is not a renewable source, so they're trying to get away from using so much of that in the raised bed gardening method. And then 1/3 vermiculite. And it is done by volume and not weight. So you would need 4.5 cubic feet. So usually you can buy like a bale of peat moss is like 3 cubic feet. So you would need 3.5 cubic feet of each of those ingredients to fill that bed. And I just want to tell you the difference really quick between the perlite and the vermiculite. So the perlite is, it's a volcanic rock and it's really lightweight. It provides really great drainage and it holds more air. It gives air in the soil, but it tends to float up. Like when you're working in the soil, it's the white, the white chunks that you see in potting soil, that is perlite typically. And so it doesn't hold any nutrients. It doesn't hold or retain any water. It just provides the airspace for drainage within the soil. So vermiculite is more expensive. It is a volcanic, or it's a clay that is in the mica family. And so it will hold water and nutrients and air. It will expand when it's wet. And so that vermiculite is the recommended ingredient. Coarse vermiculite, you can buy it at a horticultural supply store. I'm sure CountryMax probably has vermiculite. Perlite is just the cheaper option. I've used both. It is good for adding that airspace, but vermiculite is going to give you a little bit more added benefit in holding those nutrients and that water. And then you just want to amend your raised bed yearly with a couple inches of compost, which isn't too bad. Irrigation, they make some really nice raised bed irrigation systems now. Gardeners Supply at gardeners.com, they have the sip and drip system. They have like a single bed setup that you can run soaker hose. The soaker hose can be hard to like maneuver through the bed. So I've actually tried, in the next slide, there is dripworks.com. I really like this system. I have it in my garden. You can, they have predetermined sizes for raised bed gardens, like small, medium, large, depending on how many beds you have. You can buy the kit, or you can customize the supplies that you need. And you just basically punch the solid hose, you run the little solid hose up, there's a little elbow, and then you run the little drip hoses all through your bed. And it comes at different spacing. You can get it like 6-inch spacing, 9-inch spacing, 12-inch water spacing. So I really like this system. Planting, so there's different planting methods. They all deserve their own attention, and we just don't have the time in this talk to go through each of them in depth, but I just want to give you a quick overview. If you get excited about one, definitely research it more. If you need help, contact the Master Gardener helpline and we can help you, give you some research-based knowledge on the method. So there is the square foot method, there's interplanting, succession planting, companion planting, and polyculture planting. And when you're planting in your raised bed, remember to follow the planting recommendations, because when you put everything in your little transplants, it's really small and you look like you have more room, but they grow and fill in. This is the same bed like a couple months later, they take over really quickly. So give them room to grow. And if you're going to put a trellis up or taller crops, try to put them in the north, the direction of the north, and put your smaller crops towards the south so that the shadow of the taller crops isn't on the smaller crops. So just take a look at the end, the final growing height on your seed packet for those taller crops. So the square foot gardening method, what it does is it wants you to break up your bed into 1 foot blocks, and it eliminates the row spacing. So Mel Bartholomew was like, okay, you have this pack of radishes. It tells you to plant the radishes 2 inches apart. And then it tells you to leave a space between your row of 12 inches. And then you plant your next row of radishes. And he's like, just forget the row spacing. We're going to fill our block of our 12-inch block of radishes. We're going to do 3. So we're going to do 3 by 3 by 3. So you just focus on, okay, I'm going to do a radish 2 inches, a radish 2 inches, a radish, my block is filled, and then go down. So you just work on the in-row spacing dimensions. And like I said, the squarefootgardening.com or .org, they have really cute planting charts on there that can give you different ideas of what you can fit. And then you just want to pick like patio varieties too, if you can, or if you want to share plants with a neighbor, say you only have 1 raised bed, they have a raised bed, you could buy a 6-pack of plants and share the plants. You can start your own seeds. But the square foot gardening method, you work in those blocks versus rows. And it's just it's a way to pack a lot of things into a very small space. These are just some other examples of how you would plant a 4 foot by 8 foot raised bed using the square foot method. It's really easy. You get your graph paper out and plan it out right on the paper. And again, pick those patio varieties or dwarf varieties of vegetables so that you can pack more in a smaller space. Interplanting is a technique where you take advantage of the plant's natural growth characteristics. So say you put a fast growing plant with a slower growing plant. So you would put lettuce like down in front of your peas. So the lettuce is going to grow really quickly. The peas take a little longer to grow. Or you also focus on the root system, something with a really shallow root system versus a deep root system. So you can combine 2 crops together in one space. On the right, there's nasturtiums growing underneath the tomatoes. Succession planting is sowing and harvesting multiple crops throughout the season. So instead of just doing Memorial Day comes, you just do one mass planting of everything, and then everything matures and you have all of this abundance at once. Break it down into chunks and plant small patches of veggies every 2 weeks. And it's really great for lettuce, carrots, radishes, beets, all of those smaller things. Even, even tomatoes usually are too long. They take too long of a growing time, but your shorter crops like that, spread them out so that you have a succession every couple of weeks of fresh produce. And companion planting, this is the practice of growing 2 or more plant species in proximity to each other because they will benefit each other. So there's characteristics of the plant that is going to benefit the other plant. And sometimes companion planting is more folklore than it is research-based. So there are tons of charts out there on companion planting. They might not be research-based, but there definitely are plants that shouldn't be grown together that are proven like, okay, cabbage should not be grown with tomatoes. It makes them taste bitter. And then you want to try to avoid growing potatoes and tomatoes together because they're in the same nightshade family. They attract the same disease and pests. So you want to keep them separate. So that companion planting, you can dive down the rabbit hole and spend hours looking into that. Polyculture planting, so that is a technique in which you plant a variety of crops together and you treat the area like a little ecosystem. So the Three Sisters Garden is one of those polyculture plantings. The corn fixes the nitrogen the corn grows tall and gives a structure for the beans to climb. The beans fix the nitrogen to the soil that feeds the corn, and the squash spreads out and it prevents the weeds from germinating and keeps the roots cool on the corn and the beans. So it's like its own little ecosystem. And really, if you're growing in a raised bed and you're getting things to grow successfully together, that is its own little ecosystem, polyculture planting. Okay, so final tips, start small. You'll have a greater success if you start small and then slowly build up and increase your space. If you don't want to build a bed, you can try to look for a community garden. The city of Batavia does have a community garden and their beds are fairly cheap to rent. Try to rotate your crops from year to year. Like I said, if you only have one raised bed, try at least to get that tomato out of there every other year. It really does benefit in the long run. It reduces disease and pest pressure if you can rotate your crops. Clean up the garden in the fall. If you have time to plant a cover crop, that is awesome. It's best to try not to leave the soil bare, but it happens and it will be fine. And then think about adding season extension. You can add mini hoops and little polytunnels. There's a really great book out, Nikki Jabor from the Savvy Gardening. She has a great book, Growing Undercover. So she's a Canadian gardener and she grows 12 months out of the year in her raised bed garden in Canada, setting up these little mini polytunnels over her raised beds. And she has like cold frames and everything. So that's a really exciting book. Another book that just came out last year on succession planting is, if you want to get more into succession planting, it's called Plant, Grow, Harvest, Repeat. And it's by Meg McAndrews Cowden. She has a website. She's in Minnesota, just outside of Minneapolis, and she has an amazing garden. They kind of have permanent raised bed, like the mounded raised beds, and they do an amazing succession of fruits and vegetables, and they store things to eat throughout the winter. So that one's a really good read, fairly recent. I think it was put out last year or the year before. And of course, take notes, see what works, see what doesn't work, and have fun. And then the last slide is, if you do need help, contact the Master Gardeners. It's genesee.mg@hotmail.com. We do have a helpline and it is free service. We'll try to provide you with the best research-based knowledge possible for your gardening problems. And then this is what my 3 little raised bed gardens turned into. I became obsessed with raised bed gardening. This is from a few years ago, so the garden is even different now, but it is definitely an enjoyable hobby. So do we have any questions?
What are those rebars? What do they do?
So
Fence?
yeah, so I have a fence around the mulch, that big mulch area with the raised bed. I have a fence because we have a lot of rabbits. There's a ton of rabbits and they'll decimate the garden. And then inside the fence, I have some rebar in the raised beds because I use the Florida weave method for my tomatoes. I grow determinate bush style tomatoes, and instead of using cages, I weave them together to hold them up. So I have not figured out how to prune indeterminate tomatoes into a single stem. Mel Bartholomew recommends, if you're gonna grow tomatoes in a raised bed, to do the indeterminate ones so that you can prune them down really skinny. I cannot figure it out. So I just dedicate one whole, I rotate them around, every year. And I just put, like, if it's a 4-foot raised bed, I put one in one corner, one in the other corner. So I'll just do 4 tomatoes in one 4-foot by 4-foot bed. So it gives them enough room and keep them pruned so they can get air in between, and they do pretty good.
We discovered that it's as cheap to buy the pre-made 4x4 raised beds as it is to build it yourself, because the wood is so expensive.
Yeah.
And you can usually pick up those 4x4x7s.
Yeah, and there is a site too that has the corrugated sheet metal 4x4 beds, and they could be as low as like I think they were on sale for like $55 a bed.
Yeah.
So yeah, buying a kit is sometimes more economical than building your own. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I know.